The woman pressed herself deeper into the limestone cave, fingers clutching a single grenade. Outside, boots crunched over broken tile, and the voices grew louder. American voices, the monsters from the propaganda leaflets finally here. This moment would shatter everything 23-year-old Miyako had been told about surrender, safety, and survival itself. April 1st, 1945, Okinawa's western beaches, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War, began with a thunder that shook the island's coral foundation. 1,600 ships stretched across the horizon, their naval guns hammering the shoreline with shells that turned sugarcane fields into smoking craters. For the Okinawan civilians caught between two armies, the sound meant the end of the world they knew. Within days, Japanese military officers would spread through villages with a message more terrifying than the bombardment itself. The Americans were coming to do things worse than death. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if this story grips you, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't believe what happens next. The propaganda had been methodical, relentless, calculated. In the weeks before American landing craft touched Okinawan sand, Japanese soldiers moved through towns and farming villages carrying leaflets printed with grotesque illustrations. American Marines, the images showed, were beasts who would rape every woman, torture every child, murder every elder. Military authorities held village meetings where officers described in graphic detail the fate awaiting those who surrendered. Women would be violated publicly, children would be bayoneted for sport, the elderly would be thrown alive into burning buildings. Death in battle, the officers insisted, carried honor. Capture carried only shame and agony. Miyako had attended one such meeting in her village near Shuri. The Japanese army captain who spoke had seemed so certain, so detailed in his descriptions. He distributed photographs, later proven to be fabrications or images from unrelated incidents, showing bodies and destruction he claimed were the work of Allied forces. He gave her family a grenade, just in case, he said. Better a quick death than what the Americans would do. 23 years old, educated in a mission school, fluent in written Japanese, Miyako had believed every word. Why wouldn't she? The captain was her own countryman, speaking her language, defending her homeland. The Americans were invaders, foreigners, whites who had firebombed Tokyo and whose submarines had starved the islands. The mathematics seemed simple. Her own people would protect her, the enemy would destroy her. The reality of Okinawa's battle unfolded with a brutality that exceeded even the darkest warnings. But the source of that brutality would prove more complex than any propaganda had suggested. As American forces pushed inland from the beachheads, Japanese military commanders implemented a defensive strategy that treated civilian lives as expendable resources. Civilians were ordered to surrender food stores to the military. Families were forced from their homes to make room for command posts, and increasingly, as American forces advanced, Japanese officers began distributing grenades to civilian families with explicit instructions. Kill yourselves rather than be captured. Honor demanded death. The limestone cave networks of southern Okinawa became refuges for thousands. Natural caverns carved by centuries of water flow. These caves had once stored food and provided shelter during typhoons. Now they became crowded underground cities where families huddled in darkness, listening to the battle rage above. The smell inside was overwhelming: unwashed bodies, human waste, the sweet rot of wounds going septic, and the acrid bite of fear sweat. Water dripped constantly from limestone formations, creating a cold percussion that marked the passing hours. Children whimpered in the darkness, mothers whispered prayers to ancestors, and everyone waited for the Americans to find them. Miyako's cave sheltered 43 people: women, children, 3 elderly men, and 2 wounded Japanese soldiers who could no longer walk. They had fled there in mid-May as American artillery began pounding Shuri. For 2 weeks they survived on boiled sweet potatoes and water collected in shell casings from a nearby stream. The sounds outside evolved from distant thunder to close impacts that shook dust from the cave ceiling. At night, the red glow of tracer rounds painted the cave entrance in hellish light. Naval guns offshore delivered salvos that sounded like freight trains passing overhead before exploding in earth-shaking crashes. The wounded soldiers told stories between morphine dreams. They spoke of American flamethrowers that turned bunkers into ovens, of tanks that crushed positions into mud, of endless waves of troops supported by unlimited ammunition. But they also spoke of the ultimate shame: Japanese soldiers who had surrendered, who had chosen dishonor over death. These men, the wounded soldiers insisted, had betrayed everything: The women listening in the darkness absorbed these stories and held their children closer. When the Americans came, the soldier said, "Use the grenades. Die with honor." What would you do if authority figures, your own military speaking your own language, told you that capture meant torture and death? Would you believe them? If they handed you a weapon and told you to kill yourself and your children rather than face the enemy, would you comply? The women in those caves faced decisions no human should face, based on information designed to make them choose death. By early June, American forces had pushed Japanese defenders into the island's southern tip. The village of Gushikihan became a focal point as Marines and Army units worked to clear remaining resistance. This meant searching every cave, every tomb, every shattered building for Japanese soldiers, and discovering thousands of terrified civilians in the process. June 7th, 1945. The footsteps outside Miyako's cave were unmistakable now. American boots, different from the split-toed tabi the Japanese wore. She heard voices calling in broken Japanese, "Anzen, safe, do not fear." One of the wounded Japanese soldiers in the cave gripped his pistol with shaking hands. "Don't believe them," he whispered. "It's a trick." The propaganda had prepared her for monsters. What came through the cave entrance instead would force her to confront a truth more disturbing than any lie. She had been more expendable to her own army than to her enemies. The American Marine who stepped into the cave entrance, backlit by June sunlight, wasn't screaming or brandishing a weapon. He was holding a canteen and speaking softly in mangled Japanese. Everything Miyako had been taught about this moment was about to collapse. The Marine was young, maybe 20, with dust coating his helmet and uniform. Behind him, two more soldiers waited, rifles pointed down, not aimed into the darkness. The first Marine took 2 steps inside, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, and then he saw them. 43 pairs of eyes staring back, women clutching children, an old man holding a bamboo staff like a weapon, 2 Japanese soldiers trying to sit upright despite their wounds. The Marine raised both hands, palms out, the universal gesture of peace that transcends language. "Anzen," he said again, the accent terrible but the intention clear. "Safe." One of the wounded Japanese soldiers raised his pistol. His hand shook so violently the barrel traced circles in the air. The Marine saw the weapon and did something Miyako would remember for the rest of her life. He didn't shoot back. Instead, he knelt slowly, set his rifle on the ground, and kept his hands visible. "Hey, Doc," he called over his shoulder in English. "We got wounded in here, civvies too." A Navy corpsman pushed past him into the cave, medical bag already open. He was older, maybe 30, with a Red Cross armband that seemed impossibly bright in the cave's dimness. His eyes swept the scene professionally, cataloging injuries, assessing threats. When he saw the Japanese soldier with the pistol, he didn't even pause. "That man needs morphine," he said to the Marine. "Tell him we're here to help." The translator arrived moments later, a Nisei soldier from Hawaii, whose Japanese carried the smooth cadence of someone who'd spoken it since childhood. He addressed the wounded Japanese soldiers first, his tone respectful, almost gentle. "Your war is over. Put down the weapon. Let us treat your wounds. There is no dishonor in accepting medical care." The soldier with the pistol looked at the weapon in his hand, then at the corpsman who was already kneeling beside his companion, cutting away a blood-soaked bandage to examine a festering leg wound. The pistol clattered to the stone floor. What happened next unfolded in a silence broken only by the sound of medical supplies being unpacked. The corpsman cleaned the soldier's wound with saline, the sharp chemical smell mixing with the cave's damp earth odor. He applied sulfanilamide powder, the white crystals that would prevent infection, and wrapped clean gauze around the leg with practiced efficiency, all while the Japanese soldier stared at him with the expression of a man watching his entire worldview crumble. "Tell him he'll probably keep the leg if we get him to the aid station," the corpsman said to the translator, already moving to the next wounded soldier. Then the corpsman turned to the civilians. His eyes found Miyako, saw the way she held 2 small children behind her, noticed the grenade gripped in her other hand. He smiled, actually smiled, and reached into his medical bag. What he pulled out wasn't a weapon or restraints. It was a chocolate bar. He held it out to the children, wrapper crinkling, the brown squares visible where he'd broken it open. "For them," he said through the translator, "they must be hungry." Kindness as warfare. Miyako stared at the chocolate bar. In 3 years of war, She had seen her food rations cut again and again. Chocolate was a luxury that existed only in memory, something from before the war, before the shortages, before the fear. The American was offering it freely to enemy children in a cave where his own men could have been killed seconds earlier. Her hand loosened on the grenade. One of the children reached forward tentatively, took the chocolate, and bit into it without removing the wrapper. The child's mother started to cry. The Marines began helping people out of the cave, one at a time, with a gentleness that contradicted everything the propaganda had promised. An elderly woman couldn't walk. Her feet were swollen, possibly broken. A young Marine, his uniform showing the wear of weeks in combat, simply bent down and lifted her. He carried her like she was his own grandmother, arms supporting her back and legs, moving carefully over the broken ground at the cave entrance. She clutched his shoulder and wept into his neck. Outside, the battlefield stretched in every direction, a landscape transformed by violence into something alien. The red laterite soil had turned to ankle-deep mud from recent rain. Shattered tiles from destroyed farmhouses mixed with splintered wood and twisted metal. Stone walls that had marked rice paddies for centuries lay scattered like a child's blocks. The smell hit immediately, cordite from explosions, the sweet sick odor of bodies decomposing in the heat, smoke from fires still burning in distant villages, and underneath it all, the mineral smell of torn earth. But in this devastation, the Americans had created an island of order. 20 yards from the cave entrance, they'd established an aid station, canvas tarps strung between shattered walls. Creating shade, stretchers laid in rows, medics moving between wounded with the focused intensity of emergency surgery. Miyako counted at least 30 people on stretchers, American soldiers, Japanese soldiers, Okinawan civilians, all receiving the same care. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, lay on a stretcher while a medic cleaned shrapnel wounds on her arm. Next to her, an American Marine with a bandaged head shared his canteen with a Japanese soldier whose leg was splinted with bamboo and cloth. Private First Class Donald Panek, a Marine from Pennsylvania, would write in his diary that night, "Pulled 23 women and kids from a cave today. Most thought we'd kill them. One lady grabbed onto me and wouldn't let go. Kept crying and saying something in Japanese. Translator said she was thanking me. I just carried her to the dock. What else were we supposed to do?" What else indeed? The American military had issued explicit orders. Treat civilians humanely, separate them from military personnel, provide medical care, register them at processing centers. These weren't suggestions. They were commands enforced by military police and officers who understood that how they treated Okinawan civilians would shape the Pacific War's final chapter and its aftermath. But the orders alone don't explain the chocolate bars shared with enemy children, the gentle hands lifting elderly women, the medics spending precious morphine on Japanese soldiers who'd been trying to kill them hours earlier. The corpsman who'd entered the cave first was named James Patterson, a pharmacist's mate from Oregon. He moved through the aid station with practiced efficiency, triaging wounds, administering shots, directing stretcher bearers. When he reached Miyako and her group, he knelt to examine the children first. One had a fever, probably from contaminated water. He gave the mother purification tablets and powdered milk from a medical kit, pantomiming how to mix them. Then he looked at Miyako's hands. Her palms were raw, bleeding from where she'd clutched the grenade's rough surface for hours. He cleaned them with alcohol, the sting making her gasp, and wrapped them in gauze. "Tell her she's safe now," he said to the translator. "Tell her nobody's going to hurt her." The translator conveyed the message. Miyako looked at her bandaged hands, at the children eating chocolate and drinking clean water, at the Marines carrying more civilians from the cave systems, and something broke inside her. Not her spirit, her certainty. The propaganda had been so specific, so detailed, so convincing. American soldiers were monsters. Capture meant torture and death. Honor demanded suicide over surrender. Every single element had been a calculated lie designed to make her choose death. And she had believed it all. Around her, the same realization was spreading through hundreds of civilians emerging from caves across southern Okinawa. The monsters were carrying them to safety. The barbarians were treating their wounds. The shame that was supposed to come with capture paled beside the shame of realizing their own officers had handed them grenades and told them to die. But the psychological transformation wasn't complete. Scattered across the island, thousands more civilians still huddled in caves, still gripping weapons, still believing the lies. And the battle itself was far from over. The bloodiest fighting still lay ahead, where the gap between propaganda and reality would be written in the bodies of those who believed too late. 3 miles south, another cave. Another woman holding a grenade. This time, the pin was already pulled. The scale of deception wasn't measured in individual lies. It was calculated in the thousands of civilians preparing to die rather than meet an enemy that had never existed. June 12, 1945, the roadside between Shuri and Naha had become a human river. Columns of Okinawan refugees stretched for miles, barefoot women carrying babies wrapped in futon cloth, children clutching empty rice bowls, elderly men supporting each other as they stumbled over shell-pocked lanes. American military police had established registration points every quarter mile, processing the displaced thousands with a bureaucratic efficiency that seemed impossible amid the chaos. Each civilian received a numbered tag, a medical inspection, inoculations against typhoid and cholera, and directions to temporary camps where food and shelter waited. The machinery of American logistics had pivoted from delivering death to delivering mercy with the same industrial precision. But the registration points also revealed something darker. Medical examiners began documenting injuries that didn't come from American weapons, families with cyanide poisoning, children with grenade fragment wounds clustered too tightly to be from battlefield explosions, elderly couples who had drowned themselves in wells. The evidence was systematic, widespread, and undeniable. Japanese military authorities had coerced or encouraged mass suicide among Okinawan civilians. Private Michael Chen, a Nisei translator from California, processed refugees at a checkpoint near Itomen. His diary entry from June 13th documented what he witnessed. "Today we found a family of 7 in a tomb, all dead, grenade. The grandmother was still holding the 2 youngest children. Next to them was a Japanese army leaflet explaining that capture meant dishonor worse than death. We found dozens of these leaflets. They're printed on military paper. This isn't spontaneous, it's policy." The leaflets Chen described would become crucial evidence in post-war investigations, printed on official Imperial Army paper, distributed by Japanese officers and local officials loyal to the military government. These documents explicitly instructed civilians to commit suicide rather than surrender. Some versions included detailed methods: drown in the ocean, throw yourself from cliffs, use grenades if available, strangle children first to spare them worse fates. The language was bureaucratic, methodical, stamped with official seals. Die for the emperor, die with honor, do not allow yourself to be captured alive. Bureaucratized death, but not everyone had believed. Some families had hidden the leaflets and fled toward American lines anyway. Others had read them, considered them, and chosen a different gamble: risk the Americans over certain death. These were the refugees now streaming past the registration points, and their stories were fracturing the propaganda's hold on those still in hiding. Sergeant Robert Hayes, a Marine squad leader from Texas, found himself becoming an inadvertent evangelist for survival. His unit had cleared 15 caves in 3 days, each time encountering the same terror, civilians convinced they were about to be murdered. Hayes developed a system, first loudspeakers broadcasting Japanese promises of safety, then sending forward Okinawan civilians they'd already rescued, who would call into the caves describing the food, the medical care, the absence of violence. Finally, if necessary, Hayes himself would enter the cave unarmed, hands visible, carrying only water and food. On June 14th, his approach saved 47 lives in a single cave complex. The civilians who emerged, gaunt from hunger, some wounded, all traumatized, were processed and sent to a camp near Gushikihan. 3 days later, American officers brought several of these same civilians back to the front lines. Their mission: convince others still hiding that surrender meant safety. Among them was Miyako. She had volunteered, insisted actually, over the protests of camp administrators who worried about sending civilians back into combat zones. But Miyako understood something the Americans couldn't fully grasp. Only an Okinawan woman, speaking Ryukyuan dialect, could pierce the fear that Japanese propaganda had instilled. The Americans could promise safety in 100 languages, but her people needed to hear it from one of their own. She returned to the limestone hills with a Marine patrol on June 17th. The landscape had changed, even in the 10 days since her rescue. More buildings had collapsed. More trees had been splintered into matchsticks. The smell of decay had intensified as the summer heat accelerated decomposition. But the sounds had shifted. Less artillery, fewer small arms exchanges, more loudspeakers and negotiation. The battle was ending, though scattered resistance continued. They approached a cave system northeast of Mabuni. Intelligence suggested 50 to 60 civilians inside, possibly with Japanese soldiers. The standard procedure began: loudspeakers, leaflets, offers of food and safety. Nothing. The cave remained silent. Hayes looked at Miyako. She nodded, walked within 20 feet of the cave entrance, and began to speak. She didn't use propaganda. She didn't make grand promises. She simply told the truth. "I am Miyako from the village near Shuri. 10 days ago I was in a cave like yours. I held a grenade because soldiers told me the Americans would rape and kill me. They lied. I watched American medics treat Japanese soldiers who had been shooting at them. I watched them carry elderly women who couldn't walk. I ate chocolate and drank clean water. My wounds were bandaged. Nobody hurt me. The soldiers who told us to die lied about everything. Come out! Live! Silence stretched for 30 seconds. Then a voice from the darkness. How do we know you're not forced to say this? Miyako laughed. Actually laughed. The sound strange in that devastated landscape. Look at me. Look at the bandages on my hands from carrying a grenade I no longer have. If they wanted to force me, they could have sent me in there to drag you out. Instead, I'm standing here asking you to make your own choice. I chose to live. What will you choose? 3 minutes later, the first woman emerged, carrying a child, then another, then families, groups, a stream of humanity that had been huddled in darkness preparing for death. 58 civilians, 3 wounded Japanese soldiers, all alive, all surrendering to an enemy that treated them better than their own army had. This scene repeated across southern Okinawa throughout mid-June. American forces estimated they rescued between 15,000 and 20,000 civilians from caves. Civilians who had been armed with grenades, poisoned by propaganda, and abandoned by the Japanese military that had sworn to protect them. The psychological whiplash was total. Women who had been clutching weapons to kill themselves and their children were instead receiving medical care from men they'd been taught were subhuman monsters. The irony wasn't lost on American servicemen. Corporal James Wilson wrote to his wife in Michigan, "We're fighting a war where we kill the enemy all day, then rescue their civilians all evening. Yesterday I shot at Japanese soldiers in a bunker. Today I carried an old Japanese woman to the aid station because she couldn't walk. She patted my cheek and cried, 'I don't understand this war anymore, but I know which side treats people like humans.'" The aid stations themselves had evolved into impromptu cultural exchange points. Medics learned basic Japanese phrases. Okinawan women taught American soldiers how to properly fold cloth to carry babies. Children who'd never seen white people touched the Marines' faces with wonder, fascinated by the difference. And everywhere, the small gestures that bridge enemies into humans, shared cigarettes, photographs of families back home, laughter over mispronounced words, but the tenderness couldn't erase the mathematics of violence. By mid-June, American forces estimated that over 100,000 Okinawan civilians had died, some from American bombardment, many more from starvation, disease, and the suicide coercion of their own military. The island's population had been roughly 300,000 before the invasion. 1 in 3 civilians was dead or missing. The survivors carried trauma that would echo through generations. Navy Lieutenant David Russell, a medical officer on a hospital ship offshore, documented the condition of civilians evacuated from the front lines: malnutrition, untreated wounds, psychological shock. Many of the women showed signs of prolonged terror, unable to speak, unable to eat, flinching at every sound. It took days of gentle treatment before some could even accept food without crying. What were they told to make them this afraid of us? What they'd been told was that capture meant death. What they discovered was that their own military had been willing to kill them to prevent that capture. The propaganda had inverted reality so completely that safety became terror, and terror became safety. The psychological damage from that inversion would shape Okinawan identity and Japanese-American relations for decades. Yet, in the immediate moment, in the mud and blood and chaos of June 1945, a simpler truth was being written. American soldiers were carrying enemy women to safety. The propaganda had promised one world. Reality delivered another, and in that gap between expectation and experience, the foundations of post-war reconciliation were being laid, one rescued civilian at a time. The final major Japanese defensive position was collapsing. Within days, organized resistance would end, but the human cost of the propaganda would continue to accumulate as the island's last civilians made their choice: believe the lies and die, or trust the enemy and live. June 22, 1945, the firing stopped. After 82 days, the Battle of Okinawa ended not with surrender ceremonies, but with silence. The sudden, disorienting quiet of a battlefield where no one was left to fight. The true casualty count would take months to calculate, but the human cost of believing lies could be measured in every mass grave and family tomb that held those who died by their own hands. The final statistics were staggering, even by the standards of the Pacific War's brutality. Approximately 12,000 American servicemen killed, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers dead, many from suicide charges or refusal to surrender, and the number that would haunt historians for generations: between 80,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed, roughly 1/3 of the island's pre-war population. Thousands of those civilians had died not from American weapons but from Japanese coercion, choosing death over a capture that would have saved them. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Anderson, a military government officer tasked with processing surviving civilians, submitted a report in July that documented the psychological aftermath. We are encountering widespread trauma among the civilian population, particularly women, who attempted suicide or witnessed family members die following Japanese military instructions. Many expressed guilt for surviving, shame for having believed propaganda, and confusion about why American forces showed mercy. The depth of indoctrination was profound. Some civilians require weeks of observation before they accept that they will not be killed. The temporary camps established across southern Okinawa became laboratories for understanding how thoroughly propaganda could warp perception. At the Ishikawa camp, which housed over 8,000 displaced civilians by early July, American administrators documented dozens of cases where women initially refused food, convinced it was poisoned. Others refused medical treatment, certain that doctors would experiment on them. Children hid from American soldiers, having been told that white men ate babies. The psychological damage required patient, consistent contradicting, every meal that didn't kill, every treatment that healed, every kindness that countered the propaganda's lies. Miyako became one of dozens of Okinawan civilians hired by American military government as interpreters and liaisons. Her transformation from woman holding a grenade to ambassador of survival represented a pattern repeated across the island. Survivors who had been rescued became rescuers themselves, helping to coax others from hiding, translating not just language but experience. Their testimony carried weight that no American promise could match. In August, she accompanied Navy officers to remote cave systems in the north where isolated groups still hid, unaware the battle had ended. One family had been living in darkness for 4 months, surviving on rainwater and edible roots. The father had a Japanese military sword, a family heirloom he'd been told to use for honor killings if capture seemed imminent. When Miyako called into the cave, he emerged first, sword still sheathed, carrying his youngest child. "Is it true?" he asked. "We heard the fighting stopped, but we heard so many lies before." Miyako gestured to the American medical team behind her, to the trucks loaded with food and supplies, to the mundane reality of occupation bureaucracy. "They're still here," she said. "They're still feeding us. They're still helping. Everything we were told was backwards. The enemy saved us. Our own army tried to kill us." The inversion of everything. The physical reconstruction of Okinawa began immediately, but the psychological reconstruction would take decades. American forces established schools, hospitals, and infrastructure with an efficiency that echoed what German POWs had witnessed in the continental United States. Okinawan civilians watched as their former enemies rebuilt what the battle had destroyed, providing resources that the Japanese military government had never allocated even before the war. Roads were paved, electrical lines were strung, water systems were installed. The contrast between Japanese military rule and American occupation became impossible to ignore. Corporal James Wilson, the Marine who had written about the war's contradictions, participated in reconstruction efforts through September. His letters home documented the slow transformation. "The Okinawan kids who used to hide from us now follow us around asking for chocolate and trying to teach us their words. The women who wouldn't accept food now bring us tea and sweet potatoes as thanks. One old man carved me a small statue. I don't know of what, but it's detailed and beautiful. He bowed when he gave it to me. I bowed back. We couldn't speak each other's language, but we understood each other fine." The medical treatment of civilians continued long after combat operations ended. Hospital ships and field hospitals treated thousands of Okinawans for malnutrition, wounds, and diseases that had gone untreated during the battle. Navy doctors performed surgeries, set broken bones, administered medications that hadn't been available in Okinawa for years. The sick and wounded who Japanese propaganda had claimed would be experimented upon were instead receiving care that exceeded what most had known before the war. Dr. Thomas Hayes, a Navy surgeon who treated over 300 Okinawan civilians aboard the USS Solace hospital ship, recorded his observations in September. Many of the patients expressed surprise at being treated at all. Several have asked why we would waste medicine on them when American servicemen also need care. One woman cried for an hour after receiving a tetanus shot, not from pain, but from disbelief that we would prevent infection in an enemy civilian. The depth of dehumanization they experienced under Japanese military rule is only now becoming clear. The children presented their own challenges and revelations. Thousands of Okinawan children had been orphaned during the battle, parents killed in bombardments, lost in evacuations, or dead by suicide following Japanese instructions. American military government established orphanages and worked with surviving family networks to place children. But many children had internalized propaganda so thoroughly that rehabilitation required months of patient kindness. Private First Class Donald Panic, The Marine who had pulled 23 people from a cave in June volunteered at an orphanage near Kadena through October. His diary entries tracked the slow transformation. July 5th, the kids still won't talk to us. They take the food we give them, but won't make eye contact. August 12th, one boy, maybe 6 years old, smiled today when I gave him a baseball. First smile I've seen from any of them. September 3rd, they're starting to play with us, teaching us games I don't understand, but play anyway. The boy with the baseball asked my name. Progress. October 7th. They rushed to greet me when I arrived today. The youngest girl held my hand while we walked. I'm going to miss them when we ship out. The official end of the IMT. War on August 15th, 1945 brought celebration across the Pacific, but in Okinawa it brought complicated emotions. The Emperor's surrender radio broadcast, his first public address, acknowledged defeat without mentioning the mass civilian deaths, the coerced suicides, or the propaganda that had killed thousands. For Okinawan survivors, the broadcast confirmed what they'd already learned. Their lives had been expendable in service of a cause that treated them as tools rather than citizens. Miyako listened to the Emperor's broadcast in the Ishikawa camp, surrounded by other survivors. When it ended, the silence was profound. Then, an elderly woman spoke. He doesn't mention us, doesn't apologize for the grenades, for the lies, for telling us to die, but the Americans who were supposed to be our enemies kept us alive. The dichotomy would shape Okinawan identity for generations, caught between mainland Japan, that had sacrificed them, and American occupiers who had shown unexpected mercy. The long-term consequences rippled outward through decades. Okinawan civilians who survived the battle carried trauma but also testimony. Many became advocates for peace, their experiences driving home the cost of military extremism. The Peace Memorial Museum in Itaman, built on ground where some of the fiercest fighting occurred, eventually displayed not just the battle's military history but the civilian tragedy, the coerced suicides, the propaganda leaflets, the photographs of American soldiers carrying wounded Okinawans to safety. By the 1970s, Japanese historians began documenting what they called compulsory group suicides, the systematic coercion by Japanese military authorities that had driven families to kill themselves. Survivors like Miyako provided testimony that contradicted decades of official narratives claiming civilians had died voluntarily for the emperor. The truth emerged slowly. Japanese military doctrine had treated Okinawan civilians as acceptable losses, expendable resources, shields for military operations. The propaganda about American brutality had been projection, describing Japanese military values while attributing them to the enemy. The American soldiers who rescued Okinawan civilians rarely spoke of their actions as heroic. Most viewed it as simply doing what any decent person would do, helping wounded people, protecting civilians, following orders to treat prisoners humanely. But those mundane choices, repeated thousands of times across the island, saved lives and planted seeds of reconciliation. The chocolate bars shared with children, the medical care given to wounded enemies, the gentle hands lifting traumatized women, these became the foundation for post-war US-Japan relations in ways that strategic planners never anticipated. Miyako lived until 2007, dying at 85 in Naha. She spent her final decades as an educator, teaching Okinawan history and speaking at schools about the battle. Her message never varied. Question propaganda, resist dehumanization, remember that enemies are human. She kept the gauze bandages from her hands, the ones Corpsman James Patterson had wrapped in June 1945, in a small box in her home. Visitors who asked about them received the same story. I was taught to fear the enemy taught me to live. The Battle of Okinawa stands as a testament to propaganda's power and its limits. It could drive civilians to choose death over capture, could convince mothers to kill their children, could make surrender seem worse than suicide. But propaganda couldn't survive contact with persistent kindness. It couldn't withstand chocolate bars and medical care and soldiers carrying elderly women to safety. The lies collapsed when contradicted by consistent humanity. The women who expected abuse but received mercy. The children who were taught to fear but learned to smile. The families convinced they would die, but found they were safer with enemies than with their own army. They all carried forward a truth more powerful than any propaganda. Humanity persists even in war's worst moments. And sometimes the monsters are the ones handing you grenades, not the ones carrying you to safety.